Jane, and welcome. All right, that always throws me off. Good evening and welcome to MassDEP's second virtual community meeting on the draft program framework on the Massachusetts Clean Heat Standard. Just so you know, we held our first meeting last week, it was a technical session, and then we had our first virtual community meeting earlier this week on Monday. My name is Christine Kirby. I am MassDEP's Assistant Commissioner of the Bureau of Air and Waste, and joining me from MassDEP are Will Space, Emily Lamb, Angela Parnay, and Josh Cook, of the Bureau's Climate Strategies Group. And also joining tonight are Deneen Simpson. She's MassDEP's Director of Environmental Justice. I'll now turn it over to Emily to cover logistics. Emily?
Great, thanks. So as Christine mentioned, the meeting is being recorded, and to minimize background noise, we've muted all attendees. We'd ask you to put your name and an affiliation, if relevant, in the participants panel. If you need to rename yourself, you can do this by clicking on the participants icon at the bottom of your screen, and then if you hover over your name, there's an option to rename. And then on the next slide, there will be opportunities to participate in the meeting. We'll have brief pauses for clarifying questions throughout the presentation, but we'll hold some kind of substantive questions and comments till the end. And if you'd like to ask a question or provide a comment, you can use the raise your hand function. We'll notify you when it's your turn and ask you to unmute yourself to make your comment. You can also put comments in the chat. I think we'd ask that you leave substantive comments and questions until the end of the presentation, as we might answer clarifying questions throughout. With that, I'll hand it back to Christine.
Thanks, Emily. So first of all, I want to thank you for joining us and for participating in our previous sessions this year. We've had a number of them, and for engaging on the issue, and to so many of you for your thoughtful and helpful comments on our sessions, but also as you've submitted to our webpage and our email. So we're very much interested in and encourage your feedback on what we're covering today, and welcome any comments going forward as usual. As always, comments may be submitted to MassDEP's Climate Strategies email, and that's climate.strategies@mass.gov. You'll see that in the presentation as we cover it this evening. The first part of the agenda tonight is to provide an overview of the Clean Heat Standard Draft Program Framework, which has been posted on our website, as you'll also hear. I also want to note that the draft framework, it's not a regulatory proposal, but it does reflect our current thinking and the many comments that we've received, we have received to date. The second part of the agenda is to hear your comments and questions. Next slide. For background, the Massachusetts Clean Heat Standard concept was first introduced in the Massachusetts Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2025 and 2030. And that it was also endorsed by the Massachusetts Clean Heat Commission in its final report, which was issued last year. The Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2050 also adopts the framework for the Clean Heat Standard, and it also tasked MassDEP as the lead agency. Our focus is to develop the standard to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the thermal sector and implement it, importantly, in an equitable manner, which you'll hear more about later in the presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to Will Space. Will?
Thank you, Christine, and thank you to everyone for joining us. I'm going to start with a slide that we've shown earlier in past meetings, and just very briefly go over kind of what, in general, a clean heat standard is. So this slide is illustrating that a standard means that we're setting a particular requirement, not just trying to encourage more clean heat, but particular amounts. And in order to keep track of the amount of clean heat, we need a mechanism to do that. And we do that by sort of sorting all the different options into what we're calling clean heat credits. And clean heat credits happen when you have clean heat and register it with us, or somebody does, and then what we do to make it into a standard is make companies that are providing heating energy comply by holding these credits. And these credits could be showing clean heat that they did themselves or credits they purchased from someone else that did clean heat. So I said there's more, it's not the background isn't the focus of today's meeting. If you want more background, there's a number of past videos online, including some where we spend a little more time explaining this. But I did want to just do this as a quick reminder. And then, so where we are now is we're taking this basic concept and we're trying to give people a little bit more to react to in this draft program framework that Christine mentioned. So we're hoping to get comments next week. Next slide. So we're stakeholder process here. We're sort of dividing into two different sort of tracks. One is what we're doing tonight, which we're calling a virtual community meeting, which are really intended to be, the material is sort of for a general audience. So it doesn't take us too much, we don't spend too much time on technical details, and then we allow plenty of time for questions and comments at the end. We also have another track, which we call technical sessions, and importantly, we had one last Thursday, December 7th, where we did a kind of technical presentation of the framework. So you're going to get kind of an introduction to that tonight. But if you really want more details, you could look at that presentation. And then, finally, we're happy to take emails with questions, suggestions, comments on our stakeholder process anytime at the generic email address at the bottom of the screen. Next slide. So we have quite a bit of stuff on our webpage, to the point it could be a little bit overwhelming at this point, but wanted to briefly kind of remind you what's up there. And if you have trouble finding anything, you can always just email that email address and we can help you get to that. We've had that happen a couple of times. So first of all, we have some basic descriptions of the clean heat standard concept, including a 2-page summary that's kind of a different approach to explaining it than I just gave. There's a short video that goes with that. There's translations of that document. There's several technical white papers on detailed parts of a standard concept, and then comments that we've received in this spring and summer. We already presented some of those, but also we received additional comments over the summer, which we've just recently posted along with a summary. And so that's part of the new material. We also have posted now all the past meetings. I don't think we have Mondays posted yet. It may still be a few days on that, but we got the technical session from last week, which is an important reference, but also all the past videos and the slides. We also have on our website a voluntary early registration for electrification projects. And it has some actual possible regulatory text around that. We'll be looking back at that more in January, but we're happy to get comment at that anytime. We have a new frequently asked questions document that we intend to update on an ongoing basis. We've already done that once. We got some questions last week and we've updated the document to address those. And we plan to keep doing that. So send us your questions, and we're also listening for new questions tonight. And then finally, kind of the star of tonight's presentation is the draft framework that I mentioned. So that's what we'll be spending the bulk of this evening talking about. Next slide. So kind of where we are in the process, I already mentioned this December 21st, 2023, that's next week. So we're hoping to get written comments on that. It's not a hard deadline in the sense that we're going to continue stakeholder discussions into the new year. And if you think you need more time just to put together written comments or whatever, you could just send us an email by that deadline, letting us know to expect that. We'll be coming back, as I said, to the early registration program draft in early 2024. We're also close to proposing emissions reporting regulations for the fuel supply companies. We'll continue to update that clean heat standard document, and we'll continue the meetings that we've been having into the new year is our intent. Next slide. So before we move into the bulk of today's presentation, we thought it would be helpful for the community meeting format to just briefly highlight some of the comments received. As you're listening, keep in mind it's not really possible to do justice to the amount of material we've gotten in one brief summary, but I think Emily's going to do a great job of doing as getting as much of that in as you could. So I'll turn it over for Emily for the next slide to talk about our comments.
Great. Yeah. So as Will mentioned, this is just a very high level summary of some of the themes from the comments we received over the summer. The comments themselves and then a more detailed summary of them is also up on our website. So you can take a look if you're interested. And I'll just go through these points one at a time. So first in the comments, commenters really emphasize the need to include equity protections within the clean heat standard as we work on the program design. We got some very detailed comments on methodologies for calculating credits, such as using the federal GREET model or projected avoided emissions. We also got some feedback on ways to improve stakeholder engagement, particularly around technical topics. As in the first round of comments, we got quite a bit of comments on which fuels should be credited under the clean heat standard. And again, people fell into the same kind of many people fell into the same sort of two camps, one being that the clean heat standard should really focus on only non-combustion technologies, and others that the clean heat standard should credit all technologies or fuels that reduce emissions. Commenters identified that we should coordinate with the Department of Public Utilities, DPU, and the Department of Energy Resources, DOER, to make sure that we're pursuing complementary and equitable emissions reduction strategies throughout the state. Commenters raised concerns about the economic impacts of the clean heat standard and concerns about the pace of renewable electricity development and sort of the implications for electrification on the grid. So like I said, there's a full summary up on the web page and the comments. And with that, I'll hand it back to Will.
Great, thanks, Emily. So I'm going to move on and talk about what's in the draft framework. And then we'll hear from Emily and Angela about sort of a detailed presentation. So first, briefly, as Christine mentioned, this is a document that outlines in general terms what a clean heat standard might look like. It doesn't include all of the details. It's just the key elements to try and get stakeholder feedback on some of those main ideas so we can further refine the program. It's definitely not a proposed regulation in the legal sense. We need to go through a much more structured process, and we're not really very near that step yet. We're trying to get direction on how to move toward that. So the framework has 4 sections, and I'll go over those 4 in a minute. And I want to emphasize, we're going to go through the sections of the framework fairly briefly tonight in spirit of the community meeting approach, but there are a lot of materials on the website, the FAQ, and then also a recording. We tried to turn this around really quickly, so there's a recording soon after that meeting that has the recording and slides if you want to get the full kind of technical rundown. So next slide. So I'm just going to briefly introduce the kind of concepts in the framework. And before I do that, I'm going to go through this, and then we're going to hear about each part separately, and then I'll kind of review it. We understand you may have some questions along the way. We'll stop between each section. We do ask, as for questions and comments, if you could hold them until after we've talked about a particular topic. So when I ask for questions or comments, it just helps us to manage the input, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end if we don't get to something, but helps us to kind of make sure we're focusing on the questions we don't get to in the presentation. So the first topic you're going to hear about is setting the standards, and by setting the standard, we mean what has to happen across the state as far as clean heat. And we're looking at electrification, to some extent biofuels, and a kind of a phase in over time. So that'll be the first topic, and then we'll pause and go on to the next topic, which is regulated entity suppliers or energy suppliers. And this is, when we talk about across the state, this is what actually the individual companies have to do. So you want to listen to that to think about what an individual company needs to do to comply with it, and sort of how that changes over time. The next topic is credit generation, and this is kind of the one that people often are most interested in. So this is an example where if you can kind of hold your questions and clarifications until after we get to this point, that'll be helpful. This is what we really mean by clean heat. So we'll be back to looking, I think we're hearing from Angela on the credit generation part of it. And then finally, this is a type of a program that we call a market-based program where there's some crediting, buying and selling of credits. And there's a lot of concepts that get built into those kind of programs that we want to tell you about, particularly a just transition fee concept where we would generate some revenue that can help us achieve equitable outcomes in the program. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to, I think, Angela to talk about setting the standards.
Thanks, Will. As Will mentioned, we're going to start off by discussing the overall requirements that would cover the statewide heating energy sector as a whole. Just a note before we get started, we'll be defining key terms as we go, but if you have any questions about specific definitions, you can also refer to the glossary slide that we've included at the end of the presentation, and you can download that off of the Clean Heat Standard website if you haven't already. Clean Heat Standard would include two main requirements: an annual emission reduction requirement from building heating systems and progress toward full electrification of buildings. We'll focus on the overall requirements for now, and Emily will go over which entities would be obligated to comply and how to calculate that compliance obligation in the next section. First, we have the annual greenhouse gas emission reduction requirement, which would require that more and more emission reductions happen each year from the thermal sector. These emission reductions would be generated in part by electrification. We'll talk more about how to generate credits later on in the presentation. The second requirement is the full electrification standard, which would require a set number of full electrification projects to be completed each year. Additionally, a certain portion of these electrification projects would be required to support low-income households. This requirement would take the form of an equity carve-out, which requires that at least 25% of full electrification projects serve customers who are eligible for the low-income discount electricity rate that is available through their electric utility. I'll now hand it off to Will for questions, and then we'll turn to Emily to go over the regulated heating energy supplier section.
Great. So as Angela's mentioned, we still to come our explanations about regulated heat energy suppliers, credit generation and compliance, flexibility and revenue. But I just want to pause briefly if there's any clarification type questions about the setting the standard part you just heard about. Another opportunity at the end, but just want to make sure there's nothing we missed that we should have said. So I don't think there is. Josh, is there anything in there that fits that category in the chat?
There are not.
Okay, great. So let's move on then to hear from Emily about regulated heating energy suppliers.
Great. So this slide is about what types of companies would have to comply with the Clean Heat Standard, and then how those overall obligations that Angela just talked about statewide would be divided up among those types of companies. So the regulated heating energy suppliers would be the retail sellers of electricity, natural gas, heating oil, and propane. And each company would have both an emissions reduction and a full electrification requirement each year. So they would each be responsible for both of the requirements in the Clean Heat Standard. The pie chart on the right shows an example of how the full electrification obligation statewide would be split up between the electricity sector and the fuel suppliers, which are the natural gas, heating oil, and propane suppliers. So the light green sections of the pie chart show the portion of the overall obligation in 2030 that's on the electricity sector. Here you can see it's about 40%, a little less than half. And the striped area shows the equity carve out. So that's the 25% of the projects that need to serve low-income households. Then the remainder of the obligation, the dark green part, is what's on the fuel suppliers. It's about 60%. And again, the striped area shows the equity carve out, so the 25% that needs to serve low-income households. This is just a snapshot for 2030, but for both the full electrification requirement and the emissions reduction requirement, after 2030, more and more of the obligation starts to shift onto the electricity sector, away from the fuel suppliers as more and more customers electrify. In the technical session that the recording is up on our website of, we go through in detail how you would actually calculate the obligation for a specific company and how we set those numbers. And we've also put up on our website a spreadsheet that includes all the numbers from the framework and a calculator tool where you could put in example values for sales of electricity, natural gas, heating oil, and propane, and see what an example compliance obligation would look like from the standard. So with that, I think we'll pause for clarifying questions before going on to credit generation.
I'm not seeing any clarification questions.
Great, so let's move on then to credit generation.
All right. So now we can talk about how obligated entities can generate those credits in order to comply with the clean heat standard. As we mentioned earlier, there are two types of requirements in the clean heat standard: a requirement to reduce emissions and a requirement to electrify a set number of residences each year. In this program, there would be two types of clean heat credits, also called checks, one type of credit for each type of standard. We'll start by discussing the full electrification requirement. For this requirement, obligated entities would acquire full electrification credits to meet their obligation, which would be generated on a one-time basis upon the installation of a clean heat project. The program would start by defining full electrification as replacing a combustion heating system with an electric heat pump that can carry the full thermal load of a residence. To be eligible for full electrification credits, a residence would need to remove all combustion space heating equipment, or alternatively, instead of removing the equipment, those residences could commit to limiting the use of any remaining combustion equipment to backup or emergency situations. Full electrification clean heat credits would be granted one time for the installation of that equipment. For the emission reduction standard, obligated entities could use emission reduction credits to fulfill their obligation. Emission reduction credits would be generated each year on an ongoing basis from using clean heat. In other words, actively using clean heat, such as by running a heat pump in the winter as your primary source of heating, would receive a set number of credits each year. Several types of actions would be eligible for emission reduction credits. First, full electrification projects, which we just discussed. Second, hybrid heating systems, which are electric heat pumps that retain a fossil backup system and don't meet the full electrification definition. And third, heating fuel suppliers could also earn emission reduction credits through the documented delivery of eligible liquid biofuels. Regulated entities would be obligated to obtain both types of credits to comply with the clean heat standard. There would be two ways for those obligated entities to obtain credits. They could either implement clean heat themselves, or they could purchase credits from a third party, such as a heat pump installer. To start, we plan to launch a voluntary early registration program that would begin before the full clean heat standard regulation is in place. This program would encourage early action by registering residential full electrification projects that are completed before the full launch of the clean heat standard. Participation in this early action program would be limited to residential full electrification projects, which would be eligible to receive those full electrification checks. This program would not include a compliance obligation. Also, the department would offer administrative support to early action projects with resources targeted toward registering equity carve-out projects. At this point, we have posted a discussion draft regulation for the voluntary early registration program on the Clean Heat Standard website, and we're welcoming comments on it as well. While this early action program isn't the focus for today, we will be scheduling future meetings that will focus on it in the near future. So far, we've talked about how we envision the start of the Clean Heat Standard, but there would be flexibility built into the regulation to help us improve the program over time. Specifically, MassDEP would be required to hold program reviews periodically to recalibrate the general requirements, assess equity outcomes, and look at all aspects of program design and how the Clean Heat Standard has been implemented. One particular element that we would be required to evaluate would be which fuels to credit. As we discussed, the Clean Heat Standard would start by crediting electrification and eligible liquid biofuels. And in 2028, the department would be required to undergo an initial program review to consider expanding eligibility to other fuels. Additional program reviews would occur at least every 5 years after that initial one. When considering which additional fuels to credit, we would evaluate them based on a set of 3 criteria. First, we would consider a full life cycle analysis of greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production and utilization of the fuel. Second, we would consider a detailed analysis of fuel availability. Third, we would consider any effects that the alternative fuel would have on local air pollution. We would use these 3 criteria to determine which fuels to credit going forward. I'll now pause for clarifying questions, and then Emily will pick up for the last section.
Great. So I think I saw a bunch of questions come in, and that maybe would be better. They look not so simple, so maybe we'll hold off and get through the presentation and then go into the questions after that, since we just have one more section. So I'm just going to turn it over to Emily to go through the last part, and then we'll move on to questions and comments.
Great. So yeah, this last part is about mechanisms in the framework for compliance flexibility, and then a discussion of revenue that could be generated from the program and how it will be used. So first, for compliance flexibility, there are 3 main ideas in the framework about this. One is alternative compliance payments, or ACPs. This is an option common in other market-based programs that allows the regulated entities to pay a fee to the department instead of acquiring credits themselves. The second is credit banking. The framework would allow credit banking for the full electrification credits. This is, you can use a credit that's generated in 1 year, you can save it to use towards a future year's compliance obligation. And then finally, the framework notes that we need to address weather normalization because emissions from heating change depending on the weather each year. So now I'll talk about revenue from the program. So the first, the alternative compliance payments, the ACPs, could generate revenue. And revenue generated from ACP payments would be used to support future clean heat. And the framework specifically notes that ACP funds from the equity carve-out would specifically be used to support future low-income full electrification projects. Then the other source of revenue within the Clean Heat Standard framework is the just transition fee that Will mentioned at the start. So this would be a fee on full electrifications that aren't eligible for the equity carve-out. It would be a fee on the first transfer of a credit. The simplest way to think about it is probably as similar to like a registration fee for creating the full electrification credit for those projects that are not eligible for the equity carve-out, but the fee would be due at the time of transferring a credit, not at initial registration. And the funds from the just transition fee would be specifically used to assist low-income consumers during the clean heat transition. And then finally, the framework points out that MassDEP may need to offer additional support to low-income households, particularly in winters that are particularly cold or when heating energy costs are particularly high. And so this additional support could be funded from the ACP, the just transition fee, other MassDEP revenue, or other state programs. And with that, I'll hand it over to Will.
Great. Thank you, Emily. So just to recap here, just for a minute. So first we heard about setting the standards and the fact that we've got 2 different things that are part of the standard across the state, increasing full electrification, and that gets us toward our 2050 target, where we've identified the need to be nearly fully electrified as far as our heating supply in 2050, and then an ongoing increase over time in annual emission reductions. Then we heard about regulated heating energy suppliers, including the fuel suppliers, and also a compliance obligation on electricity. And matching that statewide standard, there's an increase over time. Credit generation, we're suggesting, would be limited to electrification and liquid biofuels at the program startup, but part of that is controversy and lack of clear information or actionable data on different other energy sources. So we're interested in more input on those things. We can take those anytime, even now. Our leaning right now is that we wouldn't bring in other things until the 2028 program review, but we're happy to hear more about that. And then finally, we have provisions related to credit banking, alternative compliance fees, and the just transition fee that Emily mentioned. So I think we're going to stop. We're going to move over to the question time. We're mostly going to be reading questions in the chat, which I think works well. It is an option to speak, though. So if you wish to speak, you can raise your hand. We may hold the speaking until the end, but we haven't. We'll see what we get for questions. So, Christine, I don't know if you want to add anything before we start accepting questions and comments.
The only thing I want to add is that we've been getting a lot of great questions in these sessions, and what we are doing is we're refining our frequently asked questions document. So the questions are important, and that is helping us to get information up on our webpage, and we'll mention the FAQ document. So we are refining that over time, so I wanted to mention that. But with that, I think we can just jump to the questions well.
Great, thanks. So we're going to rely on Josh. Go ahead, Josh. Thanks.
Yeah. Susan Enton, is there a recording of the December 11th meeting? Susan, there is. It's not yet posted, but it should be posted next week. June Wooding, over the summer, the CHS seemed to be an emissions reduction program. It appears as though there is a move to add full electrification to the emissions component. Can you talk about the rationale as to why you add the heat pump component to the emissions reduction component?
Yeah, the heat pump component has been in the discussion all along, although I can see why that might have seemed a little different. And the reason is that our climate planning process that's mandated under state law requires us to look at how we're going to get emissions very close to zero in 2050 to we call net zero. And that has been, those studies identify a need to get electrification to happen. And the near term, reduction year to year might not set a pace now that would get the amount of electrification we need in 2050. So we have that full electrification requirement to make sure we're on pace to get the electrification fully in place by 2050.
Christopher Chase, how will mergers and acquisitions of oil and propane companies be handled in this program? For example, what would happen if a 2 million gallon oil company purchased another 2 million gallon oil company? Obviously, the customers of the purchaser didn't double their own gallon use. New customers were added to the purchasing company.
So I think the details might be a little bit beyond this, but basically the compliance obligation would go with the emissions reported by the company. So that new company would be responsible for the total amount of emissions that happen from their new company. But I think I should also mention that that sort of issue will be, since it's related to the emissions reporting, will be covered in the emission reporting requirements that we plan to have out ahead of the full clean heat standard. And we will be looking back at, there are some sort of straw regulatory language around that from earlier in the year. So you could take a look at that if you have questions, or wait till you see the proposal come out. But the basic idea is that each year there's a company that has emissions during the year, and the compliance obligation is related to that.
Jessica Nykraz, is there a reason the carbon intensity score isn't part of the equation?
So I guess I'll answer that this way. So carbon intensity refers to like the overall emissions that happen associated with the fuel, not just what happens when it's burnt, but also for its production and development. So a good example of that that there's really general consensus about are what are called waste-based biofuels, where you're producing, say, a fuel from something like used cooking oil or something like that. And so that's really, when you burn the used cooking oil, or I should say maybe bio heat based on that, the emissions out your chimney are really the same as for fossil, but we do recognize that, considering the life cycle, as not having any emissions actually in this proposed approach. So you'd really get credit for having removed all those emissions. And then for other biofuels, which are biofuels developed from crops like soy, we're proposing to give half credit And that recognizes the fact that there's been a lot of research on that. And those crock-based biofuels tend to reduce emissions somewhat, but certainly not to zero from the fossil fuels. And then finally, the other place that's come up is in the electrification part of it. And that part of it, we are acknowledging that in our climate planning process, the electricity emissions are dealt with in other parts of the plan. So there's a variety of programs the state has that will bring on more clean energy over time, including MassDEP's Clean Energy Standard and other similar programs. And there's also the regional grid operator that looks at making sure that the sufficient supply to meet demand over time. So that's a place where we're not really explicitly dealing with the life cycle emissions because part of them are dealt with in another set of state programs.
Leslie Anderson, the underlying premise of the Clean Heat Standard is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. As such, the program should focus less on the type of energy to be delivered, molecules or electrons, and more on the ability of any technology to immediately reduce greenhouse gas emissions from thermal applications. The current standards focus too much on electrification rather than decarbonization. A better framework would incentivize and provide carbon credits for lower carbon intensive propane systems than the framework structure would focus on actual carbon reductions.
And I will say, I do think we are interested in comment on lower emission, presumably non-fossil propane alternatives. We have acknowledged that for the fossil oil heat, but not yet for propane at this time. And we're interested in hearing more about that.
Jeff Mushnick, how will monitoring take place for using the clean fossil fuel equipment as backup only if the customer is not happy with heat pump operation?
So that is certainly going to be a technical challenge that's a little beyond what we've fully figured out. There is some information in the full electrification concept that we've put forward, but another answer to that is that's part of the reason that we're having the ongoing credit for emission reduction. So we would have some sort of, the framework talks about how you may be able to tell whether people are using electric systems by looking at bills and the pattern of electricity use over the years. And so we're thinking about ways of using that sort of thing to actually monitor and, in a sense, reward people for using electric systems for clean heat and not solely for installing them.
Michael Ferrante, how does MassDEP expect small retail heating oil companies who have many low-income fuel assistance customers provide just fuel and no heating equipment maintenance or heat pump installations and do no direct marketing to customers fulfill the 25% carve out?
Yeah, I think we're going to be interested in hearing more about some of the smaller, the compliance challenges for the smaller companies. We're hoping to learn more about that in the emissions reporting phase that we'll be looking at moving before the program. So I don't have a complete answer, but it's something we're going to need to look at more closely. So appreciate the point.
Jeff Mushnick, what is the state backup plan if this program turns out not to be as robust in implementation, i.e. similar to what the federal government is seeing with the EV programs?
Yeah, I don't think I have an answer to that except to say that this program is one of many programs that are working in the same direction, including the federal incentives for going to clean heat and a variety of similar state programs.
Christopher Wagner, the Department of Environmental Protection needs to take a holistic view of energy consumption and evaluate the carbon footprint of all energy sources and the appliances that are powered by them fairly and accurately. This is best accomplished through a full cycle analysis of energy consumption that utilizes source energy metrics. FFC includes the energy consumed on site, but also incorporates applicable energy used in upstream processes, as well as the energy needed to convert a primary energy source into a secondary one and transport that energy to an end user. The use of FFC and source energy metrics has been endorsed by the National Academies and Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy.
Yeah, I think we can just mostly take that as a comment. That is a kind of a leaning that we've proposed in the framework, which is a fairly simple, that I mentioned before about the half credit for some biofuels and full credit. And I think the advantage of that, or at least the way we've thought about it, is that it has the potential to make the program quite more simple, but certainly the question of whether we should be distinguishing in more detail between different options is something that we'd be interested to hear more comment in, and we did just hear your comment, so we'll take that into consideration.
Chip Bull, who would receive a credit if a homeowner installed their own permitted whole house ducted heat pump?
So under the framework, the homeowner would have the option of keeping the credit themselves and selling it over time. We do anticipate, because most homeowners may not want to do that there'll be a mechanism for homeowners who choose to sign the credits over to some other company, most likely the installation company, so that they can use it toward their compliance obligation. And we anticipate that will tend to lower prices for the homeowner for the installation because of the value of the credit.
June Wooding, if you are looking at actions for crediting alternatives in 2028, could you consider a life cycle analysis or fuel availability or air pollution information submitted on the onset of the program in 2026 and evaluate how that is working in 2028? All carbon emissions today is better than waiting. Decarb fuels is a good transition while the electric infrastructure is being built out for electrification needs.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, and I should emphasize we do have a comment period open now, so we've made a preliminary leaning on this, but we're happy to even get information before the program starts about things that might be included at the program startup.
Christopher Wagner, not all combustion fuels are equal, and as a beneficial byproduct, propane is the exception to the fossil fuel stereotype. Propane has a source site ratio of 1.01 compared to 2.80 for grid electricity. This means for electricity from the grid, it takes 2.8 units of energy to produce and deliver 1 unit of energy to a home, compared to only 1.01 for propane. For utility scale electricity, more than 60% of energy is lost during the generation and conversion process, thereby drastically increasing emissions of greenhouse gases and criteria pollutants. Because of this, propane should be given clean heat credits.
Yes, and to clarify that's a helpful comment. And the framework, it's true, does not allow any credit for any kind of fossil fuel as a clean heat resource at this time.
Susan Enton, someone said heat pumps fail at below 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Is that so?
So I'm not a technical expert, but we're seeing increasingly presentations about heat pumps that have been installed, not just in Massachusetts, but in Maine and other parts of the world that are very cold that are working well. So we do think the technology is available. I can't speak to the particular temperature number, but there are what are called cold climate air source heat pumps that are working well.
Leslie Anderson, electrification efforts as proposed in the framework will put additional stress on the electric grid. This is noteworthy because across the US, the average duration of total power interruptions roughly doubled between 2013 and 2020. The current clean heat standard framework, which is primarily focused on fuel switching and thermal electrification efforts, will add a massive new load to an electrical network that is already strained and badly in need of maintenance, further increasing the risk of outages and demonstrating the importance of exempting propane generator homes.
That's helpful. I think because of the ending, we'll just take that as a comment, so that's helpful. Thanks.
Brad Plissy, from my understanding, the push for eliminating fuel gases is to help the environment, especially helping slow the deterioration of the ozone. You want everyone to switch to electric, which means more mini split and heat pump installations. These have Freon inside of them, which we know is severely damaging to the ozone. Fittings get loose over time, accidents happen, lines will be punctured by carpenters. Adding more mini splits will inadvertently increase Freon leakage into the environment. Will this not damage the ozone more?
So ozone is no longer the specific issue with the refrigerants, but it is true that they do contribute to the global warming problem that we are trying to solve. We are intending to solve, with our state policies. We're very much, I mean, Emily in particular has a lot of expertise in this, and we are involved in a lot of efforts. And the federal government has made recently some pretty bold moves around regulating the different kinds of refrigerants that can be used and the leaks and that sort of thing. So we're monitoring that closely, and it is an area of concern, but it's very much the kind of thing that as an environmental agency we're used to managing. So it is a concern, but we think we have it a handle on it.
Jim Blake, to ensure energy security and resilience, it is crucial for the Clean Heat Standard framework to recognize and exempt households with propane-powered backup generators. Penalizing those who have invested in these assets would be counterproductive, especially considering the Commonwealth's encouragement of actions that bolster energy reliability and resilience. Propane generators play a vital role for users, providing essential backup electric power for health and critical medical safety.
So this is a good time to point out that the Clean Heat Standard doesn't work by penalizing anybody or prohibiting anybody from doing anything. It's a crediting program that's really designed to help and encourage people that are in a position to make the clean heats transition to do it more quickly and with more support than they otherwise would. So there's no part of it that would penalize any particular type of a resource.
Karen Kraut, I appreciate the work you are doing and would like to see a clean heat standard launch. Electrification is so important. I believe fossil fuel sellers should be responsible for reducing building emissions.
Thanks for the comment.
Christopher Chase, how would a new company be handled? Say someone started a new oil or propane business during the clean heat standard. Would they have no past sales to base an obligation?
So the intent in the framework is the obligation would be based on the sales that occurred in a particular year. So however much sales or emissions really is the right way to think about it occurred in a particular year, then the following year you'd have a compliance deadline where you needed to hold the credit. So a new company entering, would presumably look at the industry and realize that complying with the clean heat standard was something that they needed to address and give some thought into how to get those credits by the compliance deadline.
Karen Kraut, I agree with that. Fossil fuels should not get credits. Chris Kowalski, as a potential unintended consequence, the push to heat pumps will require a significant increase in the use and sale of refrigerant gases in Massachusetts, while the new refrigerants of R32 and 454B have a much lower GW global warming potential of verse 410. Certainly this impact will be accounted for in your goals. Will refrigerant sales in the Commonwealth be tracked and reported, and any requirements be put on their sale beyond those required by the EPA?
I think we're still looking at the EPA requirements. Historically, we have gone beyond what EPA has done, but we don't have any specific plans at this point to go further, but we're certainly, as I said earlier, aware of the issue and concerned about it.
Jeff Mushnick, credit generation opportunities should be extended to thermal applications that can prove an immediate reduction in aggregate greenhouse gas emissions. This is a better approach than simply transferring emissions from the building sector to the electric power sector without providing a reduction in aggregate emissions, which is what will happen if propane heat is converted to electric heat.
Great, thanks for the comment.
Chris Brennan, as MassDEP's mandate is narrowly focused on heating applications, will there be a process to exempt non-thermal or non-heating fuel applications from obligated parties reporting? Applications such as propane fuel transportation, i.e. buses, heavy-duty vehicles, and forklifts, propane dryers, propane backup generators, industrial manufacturing, food processing, etc. Please be sure to address this concern in future emissions report details.
Thank you.
Christopher Wagner, your comments were that fossil fuels are not included in the clean heat standard, yet in 2022, fossil fuels generated 81.6% of the Commonwealth's bulk electricity. Massachusetts electric sector produced 952 pounds of CO2 emissions per megawatt hour generated. Except for Rhode Island, Massachusetts power sector is the most carbon intensive in New England.
Thanks. I think addressing the power sector details a little beyond the scope of this, but we have heard repeatedly the need for us to take a close look at that. And we do have an answer I've given, but we understand that there's curiosity about hearing more.
Tim Johnson, propane is a beneficial byproduct that is repurposed for heating homes, heating hot water, powering generators, as well as cooking hot meals. Propane is hydrogen-rich, 73%, consisting solely of 8 hydrogen and 3 carbons in its molecular state. Propane is non-methane molecule. When released directly into the atmosphere in an uncombusted state, propane has an ozone depletion potential of 0 and a global warming potential of only 3. Propane as a VOC has a short atmospheric lifespan. This is different than methane or carbon dioxide. As an EPA alternative fuel, propane is the perfect partner with wind and solar to reduce emissions in the thermal sector.
For the comment?
Evan Pitsley, I've asked you to unmute if you'd like to speak. And it does look like you're unmuted if you'd like to speak.
Yep. Can you please also authorize the video?
Sure.
Thank you.
Looks like with the settings of Zoom, unfortunately, I can't turn your video on.
Okay, I'll begin. Well, good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. My name is Evan Pitsley, and on Monday, I introduced myself and the impact that the clean heat standard would have on my family, my employees, my customers, and the propane industry if this proposed framework moves forward with propane as an obligated party. Tonight, I want to share a different message that speaks to the positive complexity of propane as an energy source and why it cannot practically be included in the clean heat standard as an obligated party. In these community meetings, I have learned from your answers to our questions that this program needs to be simple to implement and maintain. Propane as an energy source in Massachusetts is too complex to include. Let me explain. Propane is too versatile and reaches places where electricity cannot be used, like cottages, temporary shelters, and off-grid applications. Therefore, provisions must be included to remove emission reduction requirements for propane gallons used in places that electricity cannot feasibly reach. Propane is used not only in residential settings, which the clean heat standard targets, but also large commercial buildings, institutional buildings, industrial applications, agriculture, and in transportation, including school buses, cars, medium and heavy-duty trucks, and more. Propane power generators to keep our cell towers running, and emergency power for hospitals, fire, and police departments. Provisions need to be included to remove emission reduction requirements for gallons of propane used in these applications. Propane is used for portable outdoor living and cooking appliances and is delivered to consumers through pump stations across the Commonwealth. Provisions need to be made to reduce emission requirements for gallons of propane sold through pump stations. Propane is commonly used as an automatic backup fuel source to supplement hybrid heat pumps. This is a built-in function of the heat pump. In my experience with customers, a significant amount of fuel is used in this backup capacity because heat pumps simply cannot keep up with electricity. Provisions must be used to reduce emission requirements for propane used to help electrically powered heat pumps or geothermal systems keep up. Propane is too resilient and serves as a backup to the electrical grid through both generators and appliances that operate simply on propane when the power is out. Those emergency backup heaters tend to be used in homes that cannot afford the cost of an emergency backup generator and is an equity concern. Provisions need to be included to credit propane for use with generators and other resilient propane-powered appliances, especially as they're relied on for the health, safety, and well-being of real people. A couple of years ago, we worked with a local generator contractor to donate an installation during a power outage to a mother with a young child that needs access to power to stay alive. If the power went out for an extended period of time, that child would be robbed from their lifeline. This mother was running extension cords from nearby neighbors to her home to try and keep the life-sustaining equipment going. She shared on a Google review, "Amazing company. They have gone above and beyond for my family, and I can never thank them enough." This is just one example of many across the Commonwealth. Propane is relied upon by people to endure very difficult circumstances, especially when the electric grid fails. The example I provided was during the late October, early November 2021 wind and rainstorm that knocked power out for days in communities across the Commonwealth. Imagine if that was snow. Propane supplies energy for more than just whole home space heating requirements. Propane gallons are sold for water heating, cooking, drying clothes, supplemental or emergency backup heat, refrigerators, and gas lights, to name a few. Provisions need to be made to reduce emission requirements for gallons of propane used in these contexts. If full electrification of homes does not include changing over these common household appliances, then they cannot be fairly counted against our emission reduction requirements. You well know that converting all common household appliances would be too costly for homeowners for full compliance for electrification of the home, and honestly would cause more resistance to the adoption of this standard due to upset homeowners. Propane is a resilient and versatile fuel that has powered equipment across the Commonwealth for decades. Conventional propane is cleaner than electricity and natural gas now and for the foreseeable future. And just wait until you meet our industry's innovation in renewable propane. Propane is highly complicated when it comes to fairly determining emission reduction requirements for propane suppliers. We are a cleaner source of energy now and are determined to stay that way, even if they ever find a way to clean up the grid. Requiring propane suppliers to obtain credits to convert homeowners to a fuel source that worsens their impact on emissions and therefore the climate is not acceptable. Honestly, propane is too complicated to be included as an obligated party in the Clean Heat Standard. The Clean Heat Standard needs to be manageable to implement, simple to communicate, thorough enough to regulate, comply with state and federal law, reliant on energy sources that are resilient to meet energy needs across the Commonwealth, and inspiring enough for homeowners to choose clean energy. As I shared Monday, homeowners are the true obligated party when it comes to heating their homes and should be able to choose propane as that clean energy source without the financial burden that will be passed on to them from propane companies to remain compliant. When small family-owned propane companies across the Commonwealth begin to close their doors as a result of the regulations that could be implemented from the framework that you provide, I would like to know who homeowners should call when the power is out, and like the mother I shared about earlier is without power, and the life of her child is on the line. Propane must be removed from this framework as an obligated party, and instead should be considered as an important partner in the path to net zero emissions. Thank you.
Great, thanks for your obviously very thoughtful comments, much appreciated.
Stephen Dodge will mention waste-based feedstocks for bioheat produce the same tailpipe emissions as fossil fuel. This isn't true. Waste-based feedstocks reduce carbon emissions by 74% on average over fossil.
Yeah, I think just probably should address that briefly. So I was referring to in the life cycle, we're actually going to treat the waste-based biofuels as though they reduce the emissions 100% compared to fossil and give credits according to that, which is sort of more generous, I think, than, for example, California's program or others do. However, it is true that if you're not worrying about the life cycle and just looking at the emissions out of the tailpipe physically out of the car, there is carbon in the biofuels and the fossil fuels in similar amounts, and the pollution that's emitted at the time of combustion is similar across the two fuels.
Nicholas Johnson, the delivery of renewable propane and renewable propane blends should generate clean heat credits in all circumstances. Renewable propane should be explicitly designated as a qualifying biofuel in order to incentivize innovation and increase the displacement of non-renewable thermal fuels. At the point of combustion, renewable propane is carbon neutral because it's not releasing new carbon into the atmosphere.
Thanks for the comment.
Jeff Mushnick, 2022 Massachusetts in-state bulk electric generation mix, natural gas 77.8%, petroleum 3.8%, hydroelectric 4.5%, non-hydro renewables, e.g. biomass, wind, utility scale solar 13.5%, others, e.g. tire-derived fuels, municipal solid waste 2.1%. Why should we substitute these emissions for propane heat? Why would we substitute these
Yeah,
emissions for propane heat?
I think this question cuts across more than just propane, and I think there are, we've heard concerns about the current status of the electric grid, and I can't vouch for the particular numbers there, partly because it changes over time. But we've had a lot of programs historically that have reduced emissions. We have a regional greenhouse gas initiative program that reduces power plant emissions, and a number of programs that are in place and will continue to reduce emissions over time. So as I said, the process that Massachusetts used is geared toward getting to a goal in 2050 of net zero. And so in order to get that goal of net zero in 2050, the end state that's pictured and anticipated and planned for is to have clean generation sufficient to meet the demand by an increasingly electrified and fully electrified, in a lot of cases, equipment. So the actual state of the electric grid right now, we don't see as a reason not to start putting the equipment in the homes that can contribute to that 2050 goal in the end. If we don't get started with electrifying now, we won't get those homes electrified by 2050. And when I say, I should clarify, when I say putting equipment in a home, it's entirely at the homeowner's discretion when and really whether they choose to make that transition. But the clean heat standard is intended to provide an incentive to move things at the right pace to get to that 2050 goal.
Tim Johnson, propane is a byproduct. Propane is a produced and left over when biofuels are produced. Makes no sense that it gets no credits like biodiesel. Why are we overlooking conventional and renewable propane? We need to meet together to educate DEP on the wonderful world of propane.
Great, thanks. And I think we're getting some of that education. I think we're looking forward to written comments on this issue next week also.
Paul Schorb, the propane sellers will not be prevented from pursuing their business by the clean heat standard as outlined tonight, right? The propane advocates on this call just don't want to have to pay for the new credits. This hypothetical about a person losing access to their propane makes no sense.
Yeah, I think we'd like to have people not sort of directly comment on other people's comments. I think we've heard a lot of thoughtful comments about propane, and we'll take them kind of at face value. But it is important to emphasize that it is true that there is not anything in the clean heat standard that prohibits a homeowner from using any particular energy source or requires any homeowner to make a transition at any particular time.
Tim Johnson, renewable propane is here and growing daily. DEP must recognize propane blends for the clean heat standard. Propane is the solution to pollution. Companies will pass the costs on to the consumer. The consumer should not be penalized for already being clean. Early estimates are about $225,000 for each 5,000 heating accounts. This will be passed on in the price per gallon. A tax or penalty for using a fuel that is clean. Biodiesel burns dirtier than conventional propane. Why do they get a credit and propane doesn't?
Thanks. I think we'll just take out as a comment. So thank you.
And I would like to remind folks, if you'd like to speak, please raise your hand and we can unmute you to speak. Doug Plissy, could the DEP please define what exactly is the net zero for those of us trying to grasp this?
Yeah, so it's a little bit beyond the scope of this meeting, but in simple terms, the state has a law that requires long-term reductions in emissions from things like burning fossil fuels. And instead of requiring that the emissions go all the way to zero, they require that those emissions fall by 85% compared to a 90-90 baseline by 2050. And then the net zero concept is that the remaining emissions might be counteracted by things that remove carbon from the atmosphere, such as growth of forests and that sort of thing. Doesn't mean we couldn't get further than the 85% from reductions, but it means that the legal requirement is to have the net emissions at zero in 2050.
Nicholas Johnson, propane energy promotes environmental justice because it is affordable and highly efficient. In the US, per unit of energy, propane is 1.7 times more affordable than grid electricity.
Thank you.
And I don't see any other comments or raised hands at the moment.
Okay, well, maybe we're all set. We'll give people a few more minutes.
Yeah, just had another one pop up. Evan Pitsley, requiring a small business to obtain credits or face a fee and at the same time losing customers to a less clean fuel source will drive those companies out of business. That is the intent of this program and is clearly indicated in the Clean Heat Commission final report.
I'll just say that the intent of the program is to incentivize a transition to electricity as identified as necessary in the clean energy climate plans, and also to achieve emission reductions in the interim from fuels and gradual transition to electricity.
Tim Johnson, the program is so complicated that sellers of oil, natural gas, and propane will have to hire an aggregator to keep up with all the reporting and paperwork. How and who will be enforcing and regulating violators of this program? Out-of-state companies, are they exempt?
So I think we don't, first I'll start with the last part. I think we don't really recognize the concept of a quote out-of-state company. If you're doing business as a fuel supplier in Massachusetts, then you're an in-state company. We haven't yet, set all the rules about credit trading and verification and so forth, but we are, building on years of experience with different kinds of crediting programs, both, for example, in the MassSave program, where they need to keep track of rebates and that sort of thing. The Massachusetts Alternative Portfolio Standard, some of the programs in California are similar. So we will be, we have more work to do on this question, but it's the kind of work we think we know how to do. So we're looking forward to getting down to that and hearing more, from technical stakeholders on this issue as we work to refine the program.
Tim Johnson, who will audit the program?
Yeah, I don't think we have an answer to that question at this point. I hate to end the evening with that type of an answer, but maybe that's where we'll end up. Anything else people have?
Not seeing any questions or raised hands. Evan Pitsley, the framework allows for the natural gas or electricity supplier to receive the credit if MassSave is used.
That's essentially correct.
How could propane suppliers compete?
Yeah, I'm not sure quite I understand the question. I think that there are all sectors of the heating energy economy will be required to comply in one way or another. The situation with MassSave is there are already, people don't know, MassSave is the program that gets you like a home entity audit and rebate for equipment. And that program, already is set up to do that work. And we just want to make sure that work gets counted toward the standard. other entities will have a separate standard, and they won't have the MassSave program, but they're not directly competing with the MassSave or the electricity sector in any way that that I think we're worried about.
June Wooding, thank you for your time. This is not an easy task. Evan Pitsley, $16,000 for MassSave to convert to electricity or have your propane company install the heat pump. Lose the customer and no rebate.
Yeah, I think that's more a comment about the MassSave program. So that's fine. Thanks.
Doug Plissy, I am a MassSave partner. However, it is taking me as a small business to get paid outwards to 2 months. Will this get work?
Yeah, I think we're not equipped to respond to MassSave questions here. Sorry.
Larry Cheriton, worth pointing out that gas and electricity customers pay into MassSave.
Thank you. Yes.
Brad Plissy, so far everyone has told you why propane should not be included on this bill and have shown you that the science and number behind it. Please explain the science of why it should be on the bill and the numbers, and not just the answer because it's a fuel gas. Explain with science and numbers on why you have it included.
I think I'm going to just stick to a very broad explanation, which is the framework hasn't really contemplated, and we honestly haven't encountered comments in the past that we've called that have said that we should somehow count a fossil fuel as clean heat. So I think we're looking forward to learning more about that. I don't think that's likely to be where we're headed, and we have learned that also there are alternatives that are not fossil based that can be involved in the propane conversation also. So I think a numerical explanation I don't have, but the basic concept of propane, regardless of the other pieces, is that there's carbon in the fuel, so it gets emitted as carbon dioxide and does contribute to global warming the same as other fossil fuels.
Jeff Mushnick, soda fuel oil customers. I'm not exactly sure what that was in reference to. To what Larry Cretan said. There's no other raised hands or comments right now.
Hey, I think we can wrap up. I want to thank you all for attending. We've heard a lot of questions and lots of comments from you folks tonight. We heard equally as much on Monday night, and you've given us a lot to think about. Again, we'll reiterate this is a draft program framework. We'll be looking at all your comments. We're looking for comments by the 21st, but we'll take comments at any time. And we will be back after the new year to talk about what our next steps are for more engagement. So thank you, everybody. And thanks to Will for fielding all the questions. And with that, hope you all have a good evening.
Thank you. Good night.